Hi, everybody. How are you? Yeah. No, come on. A little bit more enthusiasm. I'm going to take my cue from, take my cue from the recital last week. We're really excited today to have Putu Hiranmayena with us. Putu graduated from UCCS music program here in 2012? 2011. Wow, it's close. Wow. I'm getting old out here. Putu is one of our most exciting students we've had come through the program, along with several of his peers. Those years we had a really incredible class as well. You heard Jay Baker last semester. We had Jay on here, and I'll ask you about that whole scene a little bit later. But let me start with a brief biography here. We'll get started. Putu Hiranmayena is an Indonesian artist and scholar. His interests are rooted in gamelan, improvisation, and metal music. And we'll just stop there. That's great. Which I love that. That's all you need to know. While dealing primarily with high adrenaline activity, embodiment, and cosmology theories. His musical works directly highlight exigency of performance in peak physical states, which provoke praxis of microtemporality. Putu has performed with gamelan and improvisation ensembles around the United States and Indonesia, most recently with Gamelan Pandun Arum from Los Angeles, Gamelan Tunis Mekar in Denver, Sanggar Meni Gali in Bali. He has also enacted as a gamelan ensemble director at the Museum School of San Diego, as well as the University of San Diego. Putu holds a BA from the University of Colorado Springs in Visual and Performing Arts and an MA from the University of California, San Diego in Integrative Studies. He has recently started a PhD program at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign in ethnomusicology, where he plans to continue his studies in new music and gamelan. So welcome, Putu. It's really great to have you here.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Glenn. Great to be here.
And he also teaches for us now, too, which we're delighted. Some of the VAPA core curriculum and the Balinese gamelan ensemble, when we can really get people back feeling confident in person. That's running in the spring as well, if any of you are interested. So welcome, Putu.
Thank you so much, Glenn. Thank you for having me, and it's great to be back. And as you were reading that bio, I just realized it's a relatively outdated one, but that I sent you there. But I think it hits all the hallmarks of what's still happening. So again, thank you all for inviting me and allowing me to come back and teach for VAP. I think it's been trying times currently, but it's been a point of optimism and positivity being back in Colorado and Colorado Springs in general. And I'm really excited to share with you today a little bit of my projects post Visual and Performing Arts here at UCCS. And so, as Glenn mentioned, after I graduated here, I went to UCSD, which seems to be the bulk of the faculty here. So, in continuing on the legacy and the lineage of UCSD graduates in Colorado Springs. And then I actually did some coursework and working on a PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, which is currently on hiatus due to various reasons that we won't get into today. Within that time span, really learned how to open up and more or less codify the performance practice and the scholarly practices that I'm interested in that pertain to, I'm going to be a little jargony here because the bio wasn't jargony enough, but as it pertains to cosmology, indigeneity, and performativity. So I'll attempt to define those the way I understand them and the way I apply them today, and in hopes that we can have a conversation with the rest of you about your own desires for creativity and being an artist today. And also, the main tenet of my work currently has to do with accessibility and equitable sort of performance practices, whilst understanding, and this is the big caveat here, whilst understanding that we all don't have access to everything all the time, okay? There tends to be sometimes a general notion that as a cosmopolitan citizen, as a person of the world, in these ways where we're interacting with the world almost through your phones and through your computers almost regularly, we have this idea that we have access to everything, and maybe in some capacities we actually don't. And so what do we do with that information? Sometimes it's a point of pessimism, it's a point of leading into some kind of negative things, but I think for the most part we can fine-tune our practices to be empathetic and sympathetic toward a diverse and growing global environment. So, I had a really good time in the Visual and Performing Arts department here when I did my bachelor's degree, and it was really a first place where I was able to, and this is going to sound weird, but I was really able to critique the academy, or critique music making and critique creativity in general, and really isolate sort of the practices that pertain to particular systems of institutional sort of ideas of artistry, but a way to critique while still creating, all right? As a way to say, I'm still producing things that I find valuable not only for myself but for the community, but also as a way to say that I'm engaging in things that are contentious and that might be ways in which I can say, all right, there are problems in certain capacities of not only academic institutions, but performance practice in general, or this idea of performing yourself, your identity in these kinds of ways. So I think one of the biggest things that I took away from being at this university, and actually this was one of the things you had mentioned to me a long time ago, and I don't know if you remember this, you probably don't, but one of the biggest sort of advice moments that Glenn had mentioned to me was, don't be afraid to be silent. And I really thought about that. And we were coming from a free improvisation perspective, right, where there's just a bunch of hotheads really wanting to make loud sounds and noise all the time. And so I think it was coming from don't be afraid to shut up and be quiet. And I had really thought about that because in the moment, of course, there was this sort of musical methodology that I had to really think about as extending to a methodology in which to apply to just human relationships, and which is why I got interested in anthropology and the way music is meaningful to different people. And yes, at certain times, based on ideas of accessibility, it's hard to get a voice out, but it's also sometimes hard to be quiet, right? And so in which capacities should you shut up, to be crass, right? And I think that was a really one of the biggest things. It's a small nugget of an interaction that Glenn and I had, but it really stuck with me until today. And so in transitioning into this, the framework and the case study for today, my life partner and my artistic partner, Dewa Ayu Eka Putri, you can see her to my left in the image here. She actually lives in Bali, and I'm from Bali. I should have mentioned that. I think it's in the bio. But I grew up in the States, in Colorado. But we just started a project called ghOstMiSt in the wake or in the midst of the pandemic, and it's this sort of transnational virtual project, or it began as such, and then I've been able to go back to Bali a couple times to pursue it further and to see how it sort of works together. But the main practice of this project was to interrogate our cultural contradictions and really confront them in a way that we knew how, but also could depart from in improvisational way. So as I'm sure many of you learned and have a lot of training in, there's many facets and factions of improvisation, many different kinds, right? Especially when we're talking about musical practice, dance, theater, these sort of expressive arts. And so reflexive improvisation here I'm defining for myself and for this practice as sort of this way of improvising your traditions and your cultural lineage and altering them in the moment and really being reflexive or interacting and critiquing yourself in time. So for example, Dewa, and I have we've been doing traditional Balinese art since we were 3, very young, right? In Balinese communities and communities where gamelan exists, and how it pertains to cosmology and ceremonies in Bali and how they pertain here. But we're also interacting with a very contemporary world. So the easiest thing we could have done was to burn our bridges with Bali and find that like there are problems in our culture that we're not necessarily wanting to partake in, and then just do something entirely different and abandon our lives, right? We didn't want to do that. I don't think that was respectful to our existence, or respectful to the people that helped provide resources for us to be here. And so how do we create something that is artistically vibrant, but also equitable for potential future Balinese peoples that are outside of Indonesia, and also within Indonesia that are interacting in a contemporary practice. So reflexive improvisation here is directly dealing with the ideas of indigeneity in terms of land and historical events of Indonesia and how they sort of led up to the moments in which we understand ourselves today. Also interacting with cosmology, so particular belief systems, right? Not necessarily religion, but a kind of spirituality, and how belief is mapped onto the landscape of Indonesia or Colorado or wherever we are, how belief is mapped ideologically through what we actually try and hold on to traditionally and what we try and push to change. And then performativity, which is, I'm using performance studies jargon here, where we're talking about a moment where you perform where once that performance is quote unquote finished, social change happens, right? So a good example of this might be weddings, right? Where the social status of a person changes once the two people get married, you know, in a very sort of heteronormative traditional sense. So all of these kinds of things are at the nugget of these. And so we kind of do a few different approaches. Either you will dance and then I improvise music over it, and then we sort of conceptualize a narrative after that, or we have a particular kind of narrative that we want to explore. So I have 2 videos to show in a moment here, where we're exploring either the historical genocide of a place, and then how that is impacting our artistic making, and this sort of impacting the superimposition of like systems on our bodies. And then the other piece that I'll show today, sort of thinking about mythology and how that actually, these intangible stories actually become tangible and lived realities through human bodies and through the interaction of politics and space in Indonesia and abroad. So that's a little bit of a frame. We'll talk more about it in a moment, but I would like to show you the first video. The first video here is called Buru, and it was a piece in which we are so long story short, there was a moment in Indonesian history where a certain kind of communist political party came through and was very contentious with a lot of the Indonesian government. And they actually, at a certain point, they created an island where they would take who people thought were communists and kill them, you know, on this island. So this piece, we're trying to understand the ideas of Indonesianness as they pertain to these kinds of the diversity that is on every sort of Indonesian island. And so the last thing I'll say before showing this video is that we also like to work with local videographers, meaning sometimes there's a tendency to exoticize peoples, right? Or, oh, I don't know, for this example, Balinese people just work in rice fields and they wear grass skirts all the time, which isn't false, but it's also not the whole story, right? So we like to work with videographers who integrate sort of contemporary technologies and really do a good job with it. So, and the person we worked with here, he's 14. So yeah, please show the video. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, that was one of them. Something I failed to mention, so there's a concept in Bali called ngaya, which roughly translates to offering. And so when people ngaya in Bali, you practice your art and music and dance and for something that's devoid of any payment, right? So any of economic capital. And so this form of ngaya we have extended to, we do monthly videos. So every month we post a video to keep us disciplined, but also as a form of ngaya toward people that are interested, or the global arts community. And so for each of our pieces, I make it a point to have some kind of Indonesian music present in that sense, whether it's altered or whatever it depends on each piece, but there is a point in which there's some gamelan in it or some flute. I have the flute here. I won't play it for you, maybe later. But it's called the suling, but that's really prevalent in the beginning of this, but I make sure to have that sort of sonic presence in it to not only to sort of reclaim traditional identity, but also as a way to say, this is how I'm extending it into the future. And so just for time, we'll show the second video here. The second video is called Kalarau, and Kalarau is a Balinese mythology of eclipses, and part of the story here is that there's a moon that is depicted as sort of a princess or a woman that's pregnant, and then the eclipse is sort of this dark entity, not necessarily demonic entity, but just kind of a dark, intangible entity that sort of is hungry for life or the prospects of life in this kind of way. So this is Kalarau. Yeah. Thank you. That's fun. Thank you. So that's just a couple of them. I think we're about a year and a half in, so we have a few, and there's a compilation of the pieces we've done on social media somewhere. But yeah, so hopefully you saw a little bit of what I was talking about in terms of reflexive improvisation, and obviously I wasn't in any of the videos except for the sonic presence, the music. So, but yeah.
Wow. Super fantastic, Putu. Let me just start off by saying how gratifying it is to see where you are as an artist. And how you've developed your craft and art and such a deeply thoughtful way, and with critical inquiry, not only to the outward world, but inward as well. And it's just amazing to see you towing these lines of creative work, of embarking on your own personal path, and thoughtfully engaging with, who you are in the world. And it's just super exciting, and it's really good. Like, the music I just find so compelling, and I just find this, and I've always found your music, your creative music side, just extremely exciting. I don't know, maybe I'm superimposing my own kind of needs aesthetically in some regards, but your engagement with metal music, for instance, I always found, that I can hear some of the urgency. There's nothing like that obviously identifies anything from metal music perchance, but I think 99% of the conversations you have about metal music, just using that terminology, and it's a very, very broad base, is extremely superficial, right? It's metal, right? But there's so much in that that tradition that has, I think, deeper roots in the past that aren't usually discussed. And the visceral aspect of the music, the groundedness of it in some respects, I think plays a part in this work. And of course, we always are driven back by gravity in some ways to talk about your Balinese gamelan background, your Balinese background, Balinese. But of course, there's so much more to your background than that, in your interest in progressive rock, heavy metal, or as a polar opposite in some regards.
Sure, totally. And I mean, the interesting thing about metal for me was that I came across it in a relatively serendipitous way, in that there really shouldn't have been in the traditional paths that I was going down. It was really weird that I found metal in general, but I found it with this community of exiles in high school, a community of degenerates that couldn't find a spot. And, we all kind of have that feeling to a certain extent. But metal actually, I say it's serendipitous because it made a lot of sense when I went back to Indonesia. So, and a lot of people are really surprised, or relatively surprised when I say this as that kind of sort of superficial way, but Bali has one of the biggest, or Indonesia in general, has one of the biggest metal communities in the world. And so within my own scholarly research, part of the reason I'm looking at metal is because of these moments of cultural contradictions that have to do with power relationships of gender, and that are similar to how metal works here. Of course, different in terms of race and ethnicity, but metal in Bali in particular is actually a huge point of reclaiming indigeneity. And actually for a lot of places, like we were just talking about New Zealand, right, and the Maori culture. And it's a way to say, especially for those of you that know a little bit about Bali, it's a huge touristy place, and it creates for a lot of people wanting to come for the New Age spiritual experience. And so they have a very particular idea about what spirituality is. And for us musicians, sonically, that New Age spirituality has to do with the really soft and kind tones and atmospheres that are very calm. But spirituality for Balinese people is very loud sonically. Like, we didn't get into another kind of gamelan, but as if gamelan wasn't loud already, there's another kind that would be my dissertation, but it's this processional music that's it's Balinese marching band, essentially, but it's one of the most metal things, not only because of the physical metal, but the aesthetics of musicality. And so it makes sense that heavy metal would actually be a point of comfort in somewhere like Bali, in a way to attach this kind of spiritual thing. So, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah.
So I have a few notes here from some of your writings that I found really interesting. and this point is kind of obvious, but when it's stated, it's a little bit profound. So I'll say this brief sentence here, standing on this ground right here in southern Colorado, the ground beneath the Ent Center of the Arts. All of us as arts practitioners find ourselves involved in performance spaces that were once occupied by indigenous peoples. And of course, that's getting a lot more attention these days, at least superficially as well, if not, with good intentions. But how do you find yourself negotiating that space, and especially being here in the States as a Balinese background musician, and going through the academy? There's a lot I want to ask you about. I loved how you said, I really appreciated how you said, when you said about this program, that the first time you started to be able to critique the academy. I hope that was, which at the time, this music program, we were in University Hall, right? And our rehearsal room was a loading dock. In some ways, it was perfect because there were no pretensions whatsoever. So I guess I'm asking you, what do you? So all of that and more. Your experience going through the academy and.
Sure. It's something that's really central to my daily thoughts, which get depressing sometimes. But but it is something that I've had to grapple with, because part of the reason, so there aren't a lot of Balinese people in the States, and in Colorado, there might only be like 4 families. So what is this large presence of like gamelan in the academy, right? Why is it becomes this sort of canonical thing? What is it doing for a place like a music department, or what does it afford students and practitioners in department? And these are things that I really have to think about as a cultural contradiction, because there are, to be frank, like in all honesty, like there are moments where I want to, burn the whole institution down as a system and rebuild, right? Because one of the things historically, gamelan, the reason it's even outside of Indonesia, wasn't entirely on the grounds of Indonesian government or like the decision of Indonesian people, right? Not that it was stolen and brought somewhere else, but because it was supposed to be doing something very particular in terms of learning how to do ethnography or learning those kinds of things. But all of the gamelan ensembles that I direct and that I partake in throughout the years don't have Indonesian people in them, right? And so I have to be, but that doesn't mean I go back to Indonesia and I still have those cultural roots, but the meaning has shifted. It's a slightly discursive thing, right? Where it's like I have to find the meaning. It's like if I don't partake in this music making with non-Indonesian people, then I don't have a practice in this thing that I'm trying to sustain. And so when I'm thinking about indigeneity here, which is a contentious term in general, because what does that even mean, right? What is an indigenous person within the context, right? It's easy to exoticize that term too, right? Oh, that person's brown. It must be a woke indigenous person or something like that. But I don't claim to be an indigenous Indonesian person, because I'm not. I was born there, but even my own history, the contexts have been with non-Indonesian people or different kinds of contexts with the more diverse cosmopolitan world. So when I think about cultural roots, it's not necessarily that I'm thinking about, I have to go back to something. It's that what are the trails and the nuggets of those indigenous histories are still valuable today and need to be elevated, right? So again, something I failed to mention, the term ghOstMiSt, the reason we decided to call ourselves ghOstMiSt is we were feeling as if there's believe in ghosts or you don't, but the idea of a ghost, right? This thing that used to be and still exists in some kind of plane, and this sort of mist and the trail that it leaves behind when its presence exists in some space, right? Every time we perform, we sort of leave that little trail, and there's a nugget of something that is ghostly, that is still there. And it's not as direct, and that's a part of the point, right? It's like, is it there? Is it not? What's the important thing here, right? Like, we're all on indigenous land now, but like, what are we doing with that information? Yeah, we can say a land acknowledgement before everything, but like, what's that doing? So those kinds of things are really what I'm trying to at least not only make into conversation or dialogue, but really be a palpable and like tangible practice within art making, but also how to think about this sort of spectrum between artist and scholar and the academy. So, yeah.
That's amazing. You brought up this word, Naya, and that really struck a chord with me because it's something we deal with here in many respects, both as professionals, but especially to our students, about what is the meaning of being a professional. We're so caught up in the idea, rightly so, of course. This is not a black and white issue. This is not like a just a binary issue of the value of musicianship, the value of artistry, the value of and what it means to walk that world. And that's the way I like to kind of think about it, is I'm walking that world. Not really I'm walking that world, not walking in that world. And that's a choice that I made, Dr. McAllister, Dr. Forshee, Dr. Rigler made at a certain point. We're wrapped up in this idea of professionalism in our culture with, our capitalist system, that I won't be succeeding if I'm not making my living, my economic living, doing the central thing I do as a musician, whatever that may be. And of course, that barely exists anymore as it is, even amongst the highest realm. But the way that you put it, I think, was beautiful. Offering. And I wonder if you might speak a little bit, since that's such a core place that you know about, that you've lived, as far as the values of Balinese gamelan in the world, the offering. What is that? Does that mean, does that transfer over and embodied in your life as a professional musician in a way where, of course, you got to make economics work, right? But I think maybe speak a little bit about that to our students, because that's an important point for them to realize moving. It's empowering, actually, right?
Totally, and we've all been students somewhere, and so or in just preaching to the choir relatively, but this idea of ngaya and offering is really about commitment, dedication, and service and duties to your community. Your communities are going to be different, whether that's a community of two people or just an internal community of yourself. I think we are living in a moment where commitment and dedication to just, I hate using this word, but things, just the general mass of the world's affordances and offerings, it's really hard to be dedicated and committed to like one or two things or a few things. We all have many interests and they all intersect, and that's sort of the point of having a degree program that is interdisciplinary, right? The point of not just engaging in musical performance, but how that actually impacts things that you talk about, ecoacoustics or environment, activism, urban planning, infrastructure, those kinds of things. And so the concept of ngaya, like if in a traditional Balinese village, it's no one asks to be paid, no one, it's your service to your neighbor. It's just this thing that you do that doesn't need to be reciprocated, but that is valuable and that makes sense to the efficacy and the existence of a community, right? And it's really hard to do that in this sort of global capitalist framework, which isn't new. These are hundreds of years old structural ideas, but we're still dealing with them in very similar ways. And so it's very difficult to say, especially at this juncture right now with political turmoil across the world, where it's like it's hard. It really is hard to commit yourself and dedicate yourself when you have rent to pay or you need to put food on the table and you're not getting really any help from national governments or anything like that. And so what does this offering actually mean? Well, we have a certain accessibility, sort of a general, ostensibly universal accessibility right now of this like social media platform and ways to connect with people that I think are being used to a positive degree, but sometimes in a superficial way. But I think part of the reason we're doing this offering, ghOstMiSt offering online is like, not only are we trying to reach people, but also trying to use the resources that are provided that actually don't cost too much, right? I mean, still cost some money. And this really started with this, so there was a moment in Balinese history where people in Bali knew about Facebook before they knew about what the internet was. And I think that's really interesting because you need the internet for Facebook, right? But it was such a presence, like this social media platform was such a presence in people's lives and an impact on how people were moving their bodies, using their bodies in space in different ways, that when I talked to people back home and they were like, do you know Facebook? And I was like, yeah, it's this thing on the internet. And they were like, what's the internet? It's like, I was like, oh, that's really interesting. So it really opened my eyes about what actually is accessible and how to use those kinds of things. And so using that platform as a way to ngaya, or offer in a way that is a little bit, I mean, it's within the purview of these economic capitalist structures, but it's almost like we can't get out of that at the moment. So how do we make do, right? That was a terrible answer for students, but do with that what you will.
Not at all. Not at all. Not at all. Let me see. Why don't we take a few questions from our studio audience out here?
Get the lights up?
Yeah, we can get the lights, please, for the house. There are people out there.
Oh, you're so beautiful. With masks.
Any questions or comments? Yeah.
It's kind of a small thing. I was a little curious about the capitalization that you have on ghOstMiSt. If there was like a specific reason for like keeping one as you did capitalized, or if it was kind of just an aesthetic.
Sure. Actually, if we can pull that up, Ben, just the first slide. I'm really glad you caught that because that is very particular. So the O, the M, and the S are capitalized to spell non-acronym, but to spell ohms. And ohm is a Hindu idea, Hindu word about love, prosperity, and just a general way of thinking about it. But it connects to that idea of ngaya too. But the reason I put the S on the end is there's multiple kinds of ohm, right? Multiple ways to provide that sort of love toward your community and toward people. And it's also a reminder for me that the Hinduism in Bali isn't the same that it is in India. It's a syncretic cosmological and spiritual practice that has to do with this combination of mainstream sort of Indian Hinduism and Balinese indigenous cosmologies. And so it's a good reminder for us that that exists within our practice. So yeah, very, very good on catching that. Not a lot of people catch that. Thank you. Others?
Well, mine agree with the statement, but what about the name itself, ghOstMiSt?
What about it? Like, why did we say ghOstMiSt? Yeah. So the idea is about like these kinds of ways, you know, when you think of like a ghost, it was at some point the existence of a physical being, and maybe its duties in the physical plane are not fulfilled yet, or they're lingering in some kind of way, or they're still present in a way that is maybe a little intangible, but nonetheless, the energies are still there. And so the ghost being sort of coupled and associated with the idea of mist, where something happens, right? Like when you spray a spray bottle and this mist kind of lingers and then disperses in ways that extend not only for that physical space, but outward. It creates a certain kind of presence that is a little more nuanced. And so, in short, that's why we called our experimental duo ghOstMiSt, because I think that's what we're doing with our traditional Balinese-ness, but also dispersing into the sort of contemporary, the world that we have lived in for a few decades now. Yeah, thanks. Is that Nate?
Yeah. I'm Steven. This might be too personal, but I'm curious about how your personal cosmology informs your praxis in improvisation. If you're tapping into anything while you're improvising that's related to your own personal sense of cosmology.
Definitely, and that framework. Thank you for that question. And that framework is really at the center of this idea of confronting cultural contradictions. Right? There's a lot of Balinese traditional culture is still relatively patriarchal, and there's a lot of things going on that I personally don't abide by or like to associate with. Nonetheless, it is part of my history, right? Which means that it's a part of my body and how I've been trained to move in certain ways. So that personal cosmology definitely, if anything, that's like the most that comes out in these practices where I have to confront these things head on. And yeah, there are days where it breaks me down and I just like can't deal with it. And you just have to sit there and not to say that I don't create, and do the practice, but it's just it's a weighted thing, it's heavy. Like even the personal cosmologies of being a Balinese person in the United States, right? Like there's no, like I said, their communities are really small, there's no other representation, and so how am I trying to be I'd like to think I'm a good role model for like my younger brothers or like the other families of Balinese people that are here and things like that. And so this was a little bit, and I'll just say this briefly, this was a little bit of my critique of the academy and why I'm taking a break from the PhD, was that I've found a lot, and those of you that know like ethnomusicological history or anthropological history, Indonesia has been like a main case study for decades, right? And so every time after VAPA, when I went to academic institutions, I was like trying to learn how to be this person in this relatively colonialist white sort of framework, but also like a lot of professors and teachers and people in the academy were like training me while simultaneously like trying to research me. And that was and I knew that was happening. It wasn't, and I've also had like some projects stolen by professors and things like that, and getting into deep theater. But it's all connected in this way where I have to really think about like what am I trying to outsource into the world, and what can I offer to people that aren't Balinese, right? Because I have a very small portion of people I can talk to that may have a similar experience, but how can I be relatively impactful for people that don't have the same sort of cosmology and experience? So that's a short answer.
That's the short answer.
Yeah.
Where do you envision or imagine this beautiful project going? I mean, or do you have goals or projects in the happening like in the future that you're working on now that you can share with us? Or?
Yeah, definitely. So this is sort of a culmination of the things that we've already been doing in a relatively more compact and personal way. But after I left UCCS, I started getting into projects about environmentalism and cleanup and ideas of sustainability of not only culture, but of infrastructure and things like that. Because one of the things that I found out shortly after when I went back to Indonesia is there's a huge trash problem. Nate knows. and there's a lot of people doing really good things from outside that are maybe implementing like trash cleanup or recycling initiatives and things like that. Almost none of them have been in conversation with actual Indonesian people. And so when you implement something that is very expensive and then expect it to run and then just leave, it's just another thing of trash, right? It's just another moment where there's trash. So I've been doing stuff like that, and again, this is more of a way to embody it and to present it artistically. But I would hope that this project provides the agency of the or elevates the agency for the videographers and the people that are actually affected by these things in Indonesia that don't have the accessibility of like going out of Indonesia to find new bodies of thought or different kinds of resources. Because that's another thing that I've been researching and a big part of my projects is that, you know, as largely American or European citizens, it's almost like we can go anywhere we want, right? Without any repercussions. You don't really have to think about like, I mean, maybe you have to get a visa or something, but you don't really have to think about like the cultural impact once you're there. It's, okay, you're there and then you have a vacation or something. Whereas someone like my partner in Indonesia, she has to do like a year of visa acquisition to maybe be able to leave Bali, and it just like, it's not a two-way street, right? So I would hope that these projects are illuminating those kinds of things and also provide pathways for other contemporary Balinese artists to think about artistry outside of the temple, outside of the village, outside of their own sort of communities as well. Yeah, so hopefully.
So, sorry to dive back to this again, but specifically, like, I think I'm kind of interested in your views on the name ghOstMiSt and cultural pride. Because I know, like, I think for a lot of us who are first generation in the U.S. and everything like that, like, trying to think of yourself and kind of your cultural past is, like, a really difficult thing to kind of comprehend together. And I know, like, I'm a music performance and anthropology major, and I think, like, when I think about my time in performance and my cultural background, it's hard for me to, for example, think of myself like performing using a name where, you know, I think of myself maybe as a cultural ghost. And I think for me, that would be very difficult to wrap my head around because I already have so many cultural issues trying to like, think about myself in this country versus another country. But I'm just kind of interested in like where you kind of situate that level of cultural relation with like yourself, where you are in certain spaces and that specific name. Because I think not a lot of people, at least like, I think people with at least my background and at the level of cultural understanding in the US, it can be really hard to think of yourself kind of as like a post-cultural person in a different country.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, and I really appreciate that question. And this idea of the name here too stems from another one of these sort of Balinese cosmological tenets, and that is there's a lot of practices in Bali where there's ceremonies for sort of negative or dark entities or dark, just the idea of darkness, right? There's the sort of antithetical to positive events or things. So there's a ceremony called Macaru in Bali where it's the acknowledgement of darkness and negative energy is elevated, because there's one thing to do, which tends to happen in this country, where it's like, oh, these are bad things or these are negative things. We don't have to engage with it, right? We can just put it off to the side or something, and we don't have to deal with that. It doesn't affect me. In Bali and in a lot of places around the world, this isn't unique to Bali. Those negative presences are going to exist, and it's make it a point to acknowledge those things and create a ceremony or a ritual or something like that, some kind of performative practice to highlight those things as a way to appease them, right? So this idea of ghost, as much as I'm also very contentious about it, right, especially being just a general Asian person in the United States, historically there have been moments where Asian peoples, Asian at large, feel like ghosts, right? Because we're here, but we're sort of you get sort of looked through in those kinds of ways. And I hope I'm not sounding like I'm making an assumption with you, but I think just based on my own experience with other Asian communities, that is sometimes how it's felt. And so for me to put this, for us to put this moniker is again, just another sort of thread of confronting that cultural contradiction or confronting those things that might actually hurt a lot as a way to hopefully become more comfortable with it in a more active way, not just like a docile, oh, I'm comfortable with this, I'm just gonna exist, but like, oh, I'm uncomfortable with this, I'm gonna live with it, but also I'm going to do something about it, right? That kind of thing. So this sort of proactive nature. In short, I think that's the thin veneer of what's happening. Yeah.
All right, well, I think we're out of time. So thank you all very much for being here and listening. And I want to say thank you, Putu. Your presence in the music program as a student made us a better music program. And your presence here now as well, it just enriches us as human beings on this planet and musicians and scholars. And thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.